From inside the Banner offices along the Inner Harbor, it is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer live on a Thursday in June. Jonas is sporting a beautiful purple polo. Jonas couldn't wear that to OTAs. You'd be showing some kind of affiliation, some kind of bias in your reporting. But I know that you are an unbiased reporter. I know that you come into this podcast with an open mind, with sound reporting and judgment, and you are not colored by the fanciness of the castle. You're not colored by what we hear and see at OTAs. You're going to give us the truth. You're going to spit it honestly.
The only thing I hate, pure and honestly, is Syracuse.
Thanks. What if that was the last job in the world? There's no other job available to you, but you had to go and cover Syracuse basketball or Syracuse football.
I don't mind bad weather, but I don't think I could spend like a winter in upstate New York.
Try 4 winters in a row.
Yeah, I know. And you paid like $60,000 a year to do it. You psycho.
Yeah.
Your parents.
My parents paid it. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It brings you together though, Jonas, that kind of weather in a way that,
so do like
you Marylanders don't quite understand.
Yeah. We have terrible summers too. And terrible winters too.
Well, you're not on campus for summer.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
I know. All right. Well, we're not talking Syracuse. We're not talking Maryland. We're talking Ravens today. If you are watching this anywhere on X or on YouTube, please like, rate, review, subscribe. If you're listening to it after the fact, write us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, and I will read it out here on the show. We are coming to you at the conclusion of the Ravens organized team activities. We're going to break down some of the final things that we saw and heard at OTAs, and we'll talk about the Ravens secondary and whether this is a potential landing spot, whether Baltimore makes sense for free agent cornerback Jaire Alexander. But first, Jonas, our word of the day: impassioned. Definition: filled with passion or zeal, showing great warmth or intensity of feeling. First known usage was 1603. And Jonas, we use impassioned. I feel like the only time you ever use impassioned is when you say impassioned speech or impassioned defense, like you did when you wrote about Chuck Smith, who is the Ravens pass rush coach, talking about defensive coordinator Zach Orr in an article on the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months. At near the end of OTAs, our final day of media access, Chuck Smith was asked about Zach Orr, because Zach Orr obviously came under some fire, especially in the first half of the 2024 season, his first season as a defensive coordinator. And Chuck Smith is not one to mince words. He's not one to hold back his passion. And he offered a fiery defense of the Ravens defensive coordinator. He discussed what he saw from Zach Orr in Orr's only first season as defensive coordinator. Here's a snippet.
Zach Orr is the guy. Zach Orr, I'm telling you, is going to be an incredible coordinator. And let me tell you why. When we were struggling last year, I watched him stand in front of these mics every week and talk to y'all. He didn't flinch. But I also watched him stand in front of a room. Someday, I mean, we played after the Bengals. It wasn't like we were celebrating, because they, from a defensive standpoint, they did a lot. They had great days on us. Zach Orr, man, looked those players in the eye. He never let the high get high, the low get too low. He stayed in the middle. And I'm telling you, he always would be positive, but he was tough. He's tough on the coaches and the players. And he would tell everybody, he would show everybody how close we were to actually having success. Like, it might be an angle of a defensive back runs the ball, or it might be a pass rusher that ran past the quarterback and the quarterback ran. Zach would stand and talk to everybody, and he led. He never flinched. And watching this cat do it, and I know last year a lot of people, they were in the media were saying, well, this guy came in and helped. No. Zach Orr did it. Zach Orr in those rooms with the coaches, he led, he made the changes in support with Coach Harbaugh and the guys on that staff. But Zach Orr truly led the charge. I'm a witness to it, and I've been wanting to say this because dude is the truth. Dude didn't flinch, and dude is going to be one of the best coordinators in the league. He is smart. He is a leader, and when you watch him work every day, this dude comes to work.
All right, Jonas, that tells me a few things. One, like a lot of the players, despite what they might say, Chuck Smith follows the media. He reads what is written. He listens to what is said. He watches coverage of his own team, and he clearly watched the coverage of last year's defense, and he watched the way that the media is such a nefarious word when we use it as kind of a overarching thing. He heard some of the narratives coming out about Zach Orr, and it bothered him. And there was a clear moment in the middle of that where he said, people were saying this guy came in and helped. Is there any doubt that this guy he is referring to is former defensive coordinator and last year's senior advisor, Dean Pease?
Well, you started showing up to some availabilities midway through the season, but I don't think you had any hand in changing the Ravens defense around, did you, Paul? You weren't working off the book, on your own hours.
I would get a couple texts here and there and offer my insight. Like
just randomly text Zach Orr in the middle of the night, Tampa 2, cover 3.
Yeah, I mean,
cat blitz.
Here's the thing:
front.
if they're not looking at your coverage, Jonas, your outstanding coverage on the Baltimore Banner, and looking to that as an example, they're doing it wrong. The entire Ravens coaching staff is doing it wrong. Jonas, you literally last year at one point predicted a play that the Ravens would run on Sunday, like 4 days before they did it.
I did?
Yeah, you predicted that the Ravens were going to use some 6-man offensive line formations, and they did.
Yeah.
It was outstanding.
I think it would probably be better to have Gianna on just for this question, because she, was at the combine and heard some rumors and some whispers from people connected to the Ravens about the general disappointment in the allocation of blame and credit for what the Ravens did and didn't do last year. But I think it was instructive to look and see like what actually to see what made Hard Knocks, and that's such a thorny issue in of itself, because there's so much editorial control from the team on stuff like that. Like there was no mention of Deontay Johnson at any point last year during that whole episodes plural,
despite the fact that he played for 2 teams that they were covering.
Right. And what you saw of Dean Pease in relation to Zach Orr was not much. Like you saw Dean Pease just kind of hovering in the back of those meetings. If he said anything that was particularly earth-shattering, it didn't make those cameras. But what you did see a lot of was Zach Orr getting up there and doing a lot of chalk talk. You did see him being pretty animated and lively in what he was telling those guys. It wasn't just scheme talk. It was also just the kind of rah stuff that you want to see from a defensive coordinator. So it was funny to see that Chuck Smith went to bat for Zach in the way that he did. I mean, I was hoping to get the last question off at that presser yesterday, but I'm glad it didn't, because instead of what we got was something a lot more interesting and animated. So I think it's a good sign of like a healthy coaching staff, that you're having your pass rush coach, a guy who has risen through the ranks in this coaching staff, not just Zach Orr, but Chuck Smith as well, rising to the level of pass rush coach from outside linebackers coach, going to bat for your guy like that. And it could also be, in the same way that, I don't know, I think of like a kind of straight clip from Aiden Hutchinson when he was coming out of the draft, talking about how important Mike McDonald was to rejuvenating that Michigan pass rush. And lo and behold, he comes to the Ravens and just really turns things around in their pass rush in his 2 years in Baltimore. If this is the last season of Zach Orr in Baltimore, because it becomes a launching pad for him and his head coaching aspirations, then that clip is going to get resurfaced how many times by the coaching staff and whatever kind of sad sack NFL city needs a new head coach. Be like, wow, look at what this guy did in mid-June, talking about the job that Zach Orr did during a kind of up and down, uneven season. So I think it was cool to see. I'm sure it got plenty of play today over all of Baltimore media. Whether it's going to have any bearing on what this team does this season, I'm a little more skeptical of, but obviously I think it's probably a pretty good sign of like the reverence and respect that Zach Orr commands in that room. And it also makes for the thorny issue of how Dean Pease's son feels about it, because he is currently an assistant inside linebackers coach who also works directly with Chuck Smith as well as Zach Orr.
Yikes. Well, it was October 9th of last year when the Ravens brought in Dean Pease. That was 3 days after the Ravens had eked out an overtime win over the Cincinnati Bengals, when the defense was allowing everybody and anybody to score on them. And it's not like the results were immediate. The next week they beat the Commanders 30-23, still give up a lot of points to Jaden Daniels. They beat the Bucks, but ends up being a shootout. Should not have been that close of a game. And then they lose to the Browns a few weeks later. The defense really didn't start turning around until that Pittsburgh game. The second Pittsburgh game, the first Pittsburgh game, I should say. The one in Pittsburgh where the Ravens offense couldn't do anything, but the defense really started to figure it out. And perhaps we were guilty on this podcast of overvaluing Dean Pease' contributions to that defense and undervaluing the kind of changes that Zach Orr made over the course of the season. We've said it, any rookie is going to develop, any rookie is going to grow over the course of the season, and the same goes with rookie coordinators and with rookie coaches. And Zach Orr deserves a lot of credit for the way that he turned things around in the second half. And we have made comparisons on this podcast to Mike Macdonald because of the way Mike Macdonald transformed his defense midway through his first year as defensive coordinator. And then they went out gangbusters in their second year, and he ends up getting a head coaching job. So that is certainly possible for Zach Orr. And it is nice to hear that the assistant coaches have Zach Orr's back. And that's also similar to what we've heard from the players. So it's just an interesting, kind of clapback, I guess you could say, by an assistant.
And maybe also a little bit of a preemptive strike against the arrival of Chuck Pagano.
Yeah.
Who, is coming with laurels and credits. And John Harbaugh is already talking about just how prepared he was for all these young defensive backs coming up to him, asking him what they can do to improve. And he already has these responses. And, he's going to be working with the secondary, which was obviously the issue last year. I still think people overstate just how bad it was just because of the sheer volume of yardage that was racked up over the first half of the season. It carried over to the second half of the season. It was so big in that first half that it, obscured basically where they finished by the end of the year. But by the end of the year, they were like an elite offense, an elite defense, one of the best defenses in the NFL. They finished, I think, top 10 in DVOA. They were a good defense by the end of the year, despite what the sheer volume of explosive plays might have said to the contrary. So Chuck Pagano is going to come in. He's going to have a nice cupboard of talented players to work with, but that shouldn't diminish, like Chuck Smith said, whatever contributions he might have. This is still Zach Orr's defense. It's still going to be primarily his fingerprints that are on this. And Chuck Pagano said that he doesn't have any aspirations of being a head coach again. I guess you could ask him if he has any aspirations of becoming a defensive coordinator again, based on what he's done and kind of how he made his farewell to the NFL a couple of years ago. But you'd rather have Chuck Pagano as your lieutenant than not. So it's going to be interesting to see just what kind of narrative develops nationally from the more tied-in reporters, whether this is Zach Orr's defense, or it's Zach Orr and Chuck Pagano's defense, or it's Zach Orr and Chuck Pagano and John Harbaugh's defense, or maybe they just don't even give any credit to the coordinators and it's all Kyle Hamilton and Marlon Humphrey and Adafe Owe and Roquan Smith, because there are a lot of very, very smart players on this defense, but ultimately it is Zach Orr, the one who's calling the shots.
Yeah, I think we can say confidently, though, that the other day at practice when John Gruden stopped by, that was the highest total of Chuck's under one roof, so to speak, outside in any OTAs. Chucky is John Gruden's nickname. You got Chuck Smith. You got Chuck Pagano. How many more Chucks can you possibly add?
More Chuck than a
woodchuck Chuck?
No, more Chucks than a butcher, right? Chuck meat?
Yeah, sure.
That's a thing, right?
Yeah, more Chuck than a woodcut Chuck, if a woodchuck could chuck. We're going to talk about Nate Wiggins and what we learned from him at OTAs, what we saw from him as well. And I want to kind of broaden this to a larger conversation about the Ravens secondary as well, because Gianna Hahn wrote about on the BaltimoreBanner.com about Nate Wiggins' offseason, how he gained a lot of weight. That was one thing that we talked about all last offseason when he was entering an NFL training program for the first time as a rookie. He played at 173 pounds, or weighed in, I should say, at 173 pounds at the combine a year ago. He was listed by Clemson as 185, but who, should never trust.
He said he played at 160 at Clemson.
Yeah, that's minuscule. That is very slight. So he weighed in at 173 at the combine. He finished the season between about 176 and 178. And he held up the entire season. He stayed healthy for, the entire way. His tackling was really not that much of an issue, but he wanted to get bigger. He wanted to get stronger. He said, really I was just getting hit a lot. Injury wasn't my big thing last year, just getting on the ground with my shoulders hitting the ground. My body couldn't absorb that contact. So it was really just getting my body to take the contact. So what did he do? Went into this offseason, said, I'm going to eat a lot of protein, a lot of steak, a lot of mashed potatoes. He's up to 185 pounds. I don't want to pretend like 185 pounds is breaking any records here for heaviest cornerback out there. But it is good to see that he has committed himself to adding weight. He's got a very high metabolism, according to him, which, hurts in terms of keeping weight on. But the hope is that a little bit stronger, hopefully you don't take away from his blazing fast speed, but a little bit stronger makes him a little bit more durable throughout the course of the season.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the guys who he'll be going up against in the AFC North. Jerry Jeudy isn't huge, but ESPN lists him at 195 pounds, and you go to Pittsburgh, and DK Metcalf is a ginormous guy. And again, not a great contested catch ball winner, not really someone who you envision as being someone who has the spatial awareness to kind of outmuscle Nate Wiggins. But then you do think of Jamar Chase, who's just so tough to bring down in the open field, who's so great at those contested catches, and then right in Cincinnati is what's T. Higgins, and just he is a guy who, when he's bothered Baltimore and bullied Baltimore, has been a guy who just boxes out those cornerbacks as big and strong as Marlon Humphrey. And
talk about a tongue twister.
Yeah, I know. And so I think you can't just put on weight for the sake of putting on weight. Like some of these guys just kind of have this homeostasis weight where anymore you risk about them losing their strength or maybe having too much weight on their frame, and you get into possibly risking soft tissue injuries. But he did realize that he needed to put on weight. I don't think he's a guy who you would confuse for a Marlon Humphrey or a Jimmy Smith back in the day. If you were to go out there and practice, it's still pretty easy to tell. You strip all those numbers away from the guy's jerseys, it's still pretty easy to tell who Nate Wiggins is, because he is still like the slimmest cornerback out there. But I think you do need functional strength to be able to play press coverage, to be able to tackle wide receivers in the open field, to be able to come up and stick your nose in there as a run defender. So whether it ends up being a positive or a negative, I think we'll know pretty soon. But I think this was always the plan for Nate Wiggins. As far back as last year when the Ravens drafted him, Eric DeCosta was kind of bragging about how often he would find himself in the Ravens cafeteria, putting away food, being able to be a guy who could withstand the rigors of an NFL season. So we'll see. I'm curious to see just how the Ravens deploy him this year, but certainly his weight could be consequential. Odafe Oweh's weight could be consequential. There are a lot of guys who I think packed on good pounds this offseason.
I want John Harbaugh. I want somebody to talk about me the way that John Harbaugh talked about Nate Wiggins putting down food. I mean, somebody just complimentary, like, boy, that Paul can eat, let me tell you. And it's great in a positive light.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody does that for me.
Do you eat?
I eat, but I don't think anybody's like, wow, you go, Paul. You put that hamburger away. You get that McDonald's.
The Shaffers, at least through the eyes of outsiders, have been known to eat quickly.
Okay.
My mom, would tell stories of meeting my dad and being awed by just how quickly they ate their food. And I think that has been passed down to me. Like for me, a lot of the joy of cooking is just kind of compromised by how quickly it goes away once the food actually hits the hits the pan or the plate. So that's why I'm not.
Sometimes you eat directly out of the pan.
No, it's just like, why bother spending 2 or 3 hours making this 5-star meal when it's just going to be in your stomach in 5 minutes time?
It's like in The Simpsons. I think Lisa says, talking to her dad, and she's like, I'm not used to seeing food on the plate. I'm used to seeing blurred images. All right. Well, they're going to be relying, the Ravens are, on Nate Wiggins a lot this year. Projected to be, a starting outside cornerback this year. He is going to need to play a lot of games. He's going to need to step up and improve a little bit from what was a solid rookie season. You're looking at perhaps Chidobe Awuzie on the other side and Marlon Humphrey in the slot. Awuzie is tough because he's never really played in the slot in his NFL career, so he is an outside cornerback. Then beyond those three, you've got a group of intriguing young guys, of which we have yet to see anybody kind of step up and break out. You got TJ Tampa, who was a 4th rounder last year. You've got Bilal Kone, who was a 6th rounder this year. Jalen Armour Davis, who was taken with a 3rd rounder, 4th rounder, I should say, a few years ago. And Robert Longerbeam, who is a 6th rounder this year. Somebody is going to step up in that group, the Ravens hope. However, it's an interesting dichotomy here and an interesting breakdown, because I looked at the roster from last year when they broke camp with their initial 53, and the Ravens kept just 5 cornerbacks on their 53-man roster. They kept 6 safeties. It was Kyle Hamilton, Marcus Williams, Bo Braid, Ardarius Washington, Eddie Jackson, and Sanusi Kane. Now, we're months away from determining who's going to make the initial 53, but you got to believe with the resources that the Ravens have put into cornerback that the Ravens might go with more than 5 cornerbacks on their initial 53-man roster. And given the kind of dearth of quality safeties right now things could change between now and the start of training camp. Seems like I could imagine them going heavier on cornerback and lighter on safety here.
Yeah, it's always tough to make distinctions or make classifications about these DBs, because they did break camp with Ardarius Washington and Kyle Hamilton last year, but they saw both as being viable slot defenders. So, like, do you consider that a safety or a cornerback for all intents and purposes? And obviously, Ardarius is now out of the picture with that Achilles, and hopefully he comes back by the end of the season. But you have Kyle Hamilton who can play in the slot. You have Malachi Starks who played, far and away more snaps in the slot at Georgia last year than as a deep safety.
He played everywhere.
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting. I guess we've kind of now swung the pendulum from the Ravens are inevitably going to sign a safety to the Ravens are going to inevitably take a swing at a cornerback. And I wonder where the Ravens see there being more urgency there because of, not only the possibility of losing out on what is quickly depleting, cast of available safeties versus now the cornerbacks who are now available in free agency, with Jalen Ramsey being, potentially a trade target, with him and Miami Dolphins no longer being on good terms, and then obviously Jaire Alexander now coming available with the Green Bay Packers releasing him. So, so far, at least, knock on wood, Ardarius is the only injury. We saw Bo Braid go down last week with a minor ankle injury. Sounds like he'll be back at least in time for training camp, if not minicamp next week. You also have Chidobe Awuzie, who kind of went down with a minor ankle injury. Seemed like he was just kind of having to retape his foot when he got hurt on Monday as well. Doesn't sound like it's going to be anything serious for him. So far, knocking on wood, don't have a whole lot of injury concerns there besides Ardarius. But certainly, with Jalen Armour Davis already getting looks at safety, I don't know who else is going to get kind of thrown into that mix, but Zach Orr said others would. I don't think you can trust any of the rookies to be able to get serious starting snaps for you there. And again, Awuzie was cheap as he was for a reason, and maybe he is the next rehab project who comes and is just like a sensation in Baltimore. But I can understand with the Ravens having as much salary cap space as they do, even though that's a little misleading because you still need money to pay these guys and to pay your practice squad guys. Where the priority is now for Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh, and making this secondary as bulletproof as possible.
Right. And at a certain point, the talent kind of outweighs need. And I think a lot of people are looking at Jaire Alexander. Just got released by the Packers for contractual issues. I mean, they just could not fit him. 4 years, $84 million deal that he signed a few years ago that was going through the 2026 season. They tried their darndest to trade him and could not find somebody to take him. So they released him. Now he becomes the top free agent on the market. Old teammates with Lamar Jackson at Louisville, still 28 years old. You look at 30 being kind of a cliff when it comes to cornerbacks in particular. And in theory, he should be still at least a year away from that. Availability is a concern for Jaire Alexander. And despite the fact that he was Pro Football Focus's number 19 cornerback in the NFL, it's been staying on the field, which has been the biggest concern for Jaire Alexander.
Yeah, he played all 16 games in 2022, but other than that, 4 games played in 2021, 7 in 2023, 7 in 2024. You look at guys who have studied his tape more recently than I have. Matt Bowen for ESPN said that injuries have impacted his long speed. And honestly, just reading this description of like Jaire Alexander in 2025, his scouting report, it reads a lot to me like Marcus Peters at the end of his career. Sudden mover with short area burst, pattern match ability in press/off coverage, which is a nice asset for what the Ravens like to do and how they like to change things. Zone instincts/vision to bait quarterbacks, ball disruptor, but narrow frame shows in physical matchups/tackling, tends to chase big plays. That is Marcus Peters' late stage almost to a T, especially with, you just think back to Marcus Peters in that game against the Saints where he just made like the littlest, the bare minimum impact on a tackle that led to a nice long Saints touchdown at the end of that one. And that was just like not exactly what you think of when you think of Ravens football. And so you drop him in as a guy who, probably will get like an incentive laden deal up to, $10 million or something. Again, no real clue what his market will be in terms of money, but he's going to be coming in looking for a lot of snaps because he's looking for that next deal. And, he kind of has a bit of a reputation as a knucklehead. I think, people who were following him closely in Green Bay will remember that the Packers had to suspend him in 2023 for one game for his shenanigans with that coin toss of, going in there, not being what he was supposed to be, what he wasn't declared. And there was this whole situation where he was just not really being a good citizen in what is usually a kind of pretty buttoned up Green Bay culture. So it could be a situation where, he comes to Baltimore. It's a clean start for him. He has Lamar to kind of vouch for him, but we also thought that, Deontay Johnson would be a viable, rehab candidate. Not only his play, but his attitude in the locker room. And even when the Ravens were winning, he wasn't getting the ball and he was throwing fits after wins. So would Jaire Alexander be any more of a stable kind of presence in Baltimore if just he doesn't have the goods to be better than a Jalen Armour Davis or Chidobe Awuzie or any of these guys who might be on the outside? Would he be okay not being a guy who starts in like against base formations where it's Nate Wiggins on one side and Marlon Humphrey on the other? That's a tough sell, especially when you think of a team like the Rams who could really use a guy like him. It can also be interested in a guy like Jalen Ramsey given his familiarity there. But I just think that there are a lot more teams with probably a lot more money and also perhaps a bigger need just in terms of sheer rust or hole size to go get a guy like him.
Yeah. You mentioned Deontay Johnson. I mean, he came here and we assumed that the Ravens had done their homework and had felt comfortable. That's what they said. Eric Costa said when discussing it that they felt comfortable with taking him in and they knew about his history and they expected him to fit right in and accept his role. And he didn't. And it's clear that Eric DeCosta whiffed on that one. I think we could put Eddie Jackson in a similar category. I mean, when discussing it in hindsight, EDC said, maybe I need to do a better job of talking directly to players and being honest with what their role is going to be when they come to Baltimore. I mean, these are a lot of very talented former starter players, Deontay Johnson, Eddie Jackson, who came to Baltimore and had to accept smaller roles than they were used to and weren't very comfortable with that. And so, one, I mean, they also didn't help themselves by playing poorly when they were on the field.
Right.
But those are guys that, the Ravens took shots on, and they weren't huge shots. It was a trade deadline deal that involved a day 3 pick when it came to Deontay Johnson. And the Eddie Jackson deal was one that was signed a few weeks before the start of the season. But those were guys that were on the, in interesting spots on the roster that the Ravens had to call upon to use at times in the season when other guys went down, and they couldn't rely on those guys. I would be interested if the Ravens had a conversation with Jaire Alexander, what EDC would say his role would be. And if Jaire Alexander asks, am I starting over Chidobe Awuzie? Am I starting on the outside week 1, whether Eric DeCosta would guarantee him that job or say you're going to have to battle it out. And that's an interesting dynamic because it's not just about bringing in the best talent available. It's bringing in the talent that wants to be here, that can accept a smaller role, and that wants the best for the team.
Yeah, and we don't know what Eric DeCosta, he has to maintain relationships with agents and guys around the league, and we don't know what he might have told Awuzie's agent about the kind of inside track to that position. We don't know what he told about Wiggins' agent, Marlon Humphrey's agent. There are a lot of egos, at a position as kind of volatile as cornerback to consider here. And I still think, I really don't make a whole lot of those kind of phony lists where some guy in Vegas tries to predict where the free agent will go and makes kind of BS odds. And I think the one that I saw had the Ravens like 5th or 6th most likely team for Jaire Alexander, which is surprisingly pretty low because the Ravens are always like near the top for whatever
veteran player,
big name free agent, because it's such a Ravens move for them to come back to Baltimore and find a nice retirement home with the Ravens, but
especially one who's been released, so there's no comp pick attached to him.
Exactly. So would it surprise me if the Ravens, had serious interest in Jaire Alexander because of where they are, because of how close they are to being, if they're not already, I think bringing in Jaire and getting a good year health wise out of him would make them pretty clearly, I think, the best team in the AFC. I mean, just every single position would have 1 or 2 guys who could be in all pro on this defense. And that's to say nothing of potential juggernaut they have on offense. But, we know that Steve Bisciotti likes to have, he's very invested in the draft process. Obviously more invested in day one, the chance to have these young guys at some point be able to show their wares. And, he's certainly going to have a preference for having Jaire Alexander out there as opposed to Bilal Kone. But, maybe he's wants to see Jalen Armour-Davis get his shot if he's healthy. Maybe he wants to see Awuzie do his thing. And so that is going to be something to consider just as the Ravens make a move or don't make a move for Alexander. And I mean, there are like a third of the league basically at this point could be in the mix for Jaire Alexander. And this could be a market that develops pretty quickly, or it could take a while to develop because he and his agent aren't happy with what's out there. I mean, I think it's pretty instructive that, he was hanging kind of in the wind there for as long as he was in Green Bay, and none of the 31 other teams out there made Green Bay an offer for a trade to get him off their books.
Yeah.
And I think that tells you what other teams think about where he is ability wise, and also just what they're willing to give up to go get a guy who could potentially be a shutdown cornerback again.
Yeah. And while it is nice to fantasize and to look at a roster on paper and say, all right, Jaire Alexander makes this team better, we were not looking at the roster at this point last year and saying, well, Darius Washington's going to play way better than Eddie Jackson and Marcus Williams. Right. Sometimes the younger guys surprise you. And I think Jalen Armour-Davis is one of those guys that is kind of similar to our Darius Washington. He's got much better size, much more prototypical size for his position, but he's kind of in a similar category as our Darius Washington, where injuries have affected him a lot. And he has just kind of been buried on the depth chart at times, but he has the talent to be an impact player. We've seen these guys in their 2nd, 3rd, 4th years with the Ravens in the secondary take steps up. We've seen it several times. Geno Stone is another guy who fits that category. So
the baseline is just be better than Brandon Stevens, and that is not a high bar.
Right. And I expect this secondary to improve across the board just because of the things that are going on behind the scenes, because of Zach Orr's development as defensive coordinator, because of the improved communication that they've been talking about and that we've seen in practice. So whether they make a move for Jaire Alexander or not, we will have you completely covered on the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months. Jonas, we are going to be at mandatory minicamp next week. Are you excited to be back in the Maryland sun, baking out on the practice fields at Owings Mills? Because you've worked up quite a tan here.
Not a tan, all red.
I see some tan. Come on.
No, it's probably just the redness of my hair. I made the smart decision to go get suntan lotion, then forgot to put it on my neck last week, which was fun. But yeah, I'm glad that they aren't practicing today because I think today was supposed to get pretty nasty, and it is pretty nasty.
Yeah. A little
But yeah,
soupy.
we're gonna have probably pretty close to a full house, obviously next week with all the guys coming to Baltimore. Certainly the folks who are injured, Ardarius, Emory Jones, are not going to be playing, but it sounds like we're going to get the chance to talk to Lamar on Tuesday, who obviously again has thrust himself into the very annoying, never-ending conversations about the value of OTAs with his continued absence. But Kyle Van Noy is going to be coming back. We saw Kyle Hamilton come back the other day. Rashad Bateman and Zay Flowers should be back up to full speed along with DeAndre Hopkins. So, the selfish part of me wishes that we had 3 days with these guys instead of 2. That's usually the allotment for that Harbaugh gives for mandatory minicamp, but it's just 2 days. So it sounds like Lamar's gonna be talking on Tuesday, Harbaugh on Wednesday, a bunch of different other guys going up to the podium on those 2 days. But certainly, it's been a while since we talked to Lamar, and a bunch of different questions to ask him that are important in the short term and the long term. And I just don't know if we have enough time in the day to kind of get to all the salient parts of his role in this Ravens Super Bowl push.
Yeah. Are we going to be parked on a bench outside the facility again?
I don't know.
We shall find out. We will have a podcast for you regardless next week.
I will say, I do have a Q&A coming out with Tez Walker, second-year wide receiver.
Great plug.
Tomorrow. Thank you, Paul. And, obviously had to ask him about Lamar and everything that's going on. He said, he acknowledged the importance of doing the best that you can with the reps that you get with Lamar. And I asked him, well, you're pretty much doing exclusively in OTAs with Devin Leary and Cooper Rush. So is there any kind of disappointment that it's not with Lamar? He's like, not really, because when Lamar gets here, that he's going to be locked in. That it's going to raise the level of intensity and focus, which you could say is an argument for Lamar being there, because if just one guy can single-handedly raise the temperature of the OTAs, and he should probably be there for the entirety. But again, he wasn't there last year. He had one of the greatest seasons by a quarterback ever. He also told me that the wide receivers are already talking about, going down to Florida, doing that classic wide receiver quarterback powwow, meeting with him, getting some reps in. So that is, I think, the expectation for every offseason, especially when, one with as many young guys as the Ravens have, one with as many Florida connections as the Ravens have. But it was still nice to hear from Tez that even someone as relatively low on the depth chart as him is already, kind of forming ideas with the other wide receivers to go meet with Lamar. Hopefully Lamar's receptive to it. Hopefully Lamar's schedule allows for it, so that those guys can get in the work and maybe make up for some of the missed time that they couldn't get in during OTAs.
That's like you and I. We work on our chemistry when we're not podcasting.
Remotely, in person.
Yeah, we meet in South Florida and we just get our reps in. I say something, you say something. I'm like, hey, maybe you should have said that better. It's like you're running routes.
I'm hitting the bench. You're spotting me.
Exactly.
I'm doing the roll rack. You're spotting me.
No, none of that stuff.
You're spotting me.
Just practicing. Conversing. I'm skipping all the days.
You're spotting me.
For Jonas Shaffer, I'm Paul Mancano. That just about does it for our show today. Thanks so much for tuning in. Like, rate, review, subscribe anywhere that you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, tune into all of our coverage on the BaltimoreBanner.com with Gianna and Kyle and Jonas and perhaps myself. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.